we're going to do a installation of Ubuntu 10.10. We're going to do it in a VM for a couple reasons, mainly being it's much easier to record and display. The differences between a real install on hardware and the install on a VM is going to be very minute. When those changes do appear, I will tell everybody about them. To follow along with this demonstration, you're going to need two tools. First thing you're going to need is a copy of Virtualbox. All you have to do is go to virtualbox.org. On the left, click Downloads, and download for the version that is consistent with your natively installed operating system. So if you're on Windows and you want to do a Ubuntu VM, the very top choice says for Windows host. Go ahead and download that. The second thing you're going to need is a Bootable Iso for Ubuntu. An ISO is a CD image. Doing it in a VirtualBox, we don't need to burn a physical CD. We can point it at that image of a CD. If you go to releases.ubuntu.com, you can pick a whole bunch of older releases, mainly the long-term support releases. If you go ahead and click on 1010, the very first choice is PC Intel x86 32-bit desktop CD image. Go ahead and click that, and your download of the ISO file will begin. Go ahead and download that. Install VirtualBox. When the installation is complete, you'll be presented with a screen like this. To go ahead and do the installation process, really you only have to do a couple steps, and this is defining the virtual hardware that it's going to be on. Go ahead and click New in the top left. Welcome screen. Go ahead and type in the name of the operating system you want to call it. You can call it anything you want. This is so intelligent. As soon as I start to type Ubuntu, it automatically changes the operating system to Linux and the version to Ubuntu, which is correct, which is what we want. Go ahead and click Next. For the memory size, you never want to go above half of your physical RAM. We're going to pick 512. 512 is plenty for virtually every version of Linux. Next, the choice is to create a hard disk, to create a virtual hard disk. Now you can use an existing hard disk. You only do that when you're transferring a VM from computer to computer, or if you download a pre-compiled hard disk image from like VMware, a appliance store, quote unquote. It's all free to download, or from turnkeylinux.com, which I really like. We're going to create a brand new one because this is a fresh install. Go ahead and click Next. There are two choices here: dynamically expanding storage and fixed size storage. Fixed size storage has the benefit of technically it can be resized later. It can be made bigger later. The downside is when you create this hard disk, it will take minutes to create. If you pick a 40, 60, 80 gigabyte hard drive, it will take a little bit of time for that disk to be created, where if you do dynamically expanding disk, it will basically do it on the fly, which means when you copy large files to it, it will take a little bit longer than it should take even in a VM because it's expanding that hard disk size. But to do the setup for it takes a second. We're going to do 8 gigs, which is plenty for virtually every version of Linux. There are versions that can run off a floppy disk. 8 gigs should do you well enough unless you download lots of content. Okay, first thing I do is before I boot up, I go into Settings and I change two settings. The first one is Network. I always change it to bridged. I don't like NAT. What NAT means is it's technically going to put that virtual operating system on a different network than every other devices on your network, which means it's going to be a little bit more complicated to access that over the network, or vice versa, connect to your network from that. So I always change the bridge. It makes it much easier. Display, virtual memory, I always push it up to 16. 16 is a nice number. Go ahead and double click it and you're going to be taken to the first time run wizard. First thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to emulate a Windows drive on this computer, and I'm going to do it by mounting parted magic and creating a NTFS drive on this computer. This is exactly like booting to a live CD on your real computer, only you're doing it in a VM. There's certain flexibilities that you gain from doing stuff in a VM. It's great to test and play with. The only time I encourage someone to do it long term is if they only have very small specific needs in a VM. If you really have any long-term goals, I highly encourage you to install it on bare metal hardware. For a lot of new users, I always suggest get a second computer, get an old computer. You can literally run it on 6, 8, 10-year-old computers, and for the most part, it will run perfectly fine. Okay, this should be booting up here. And all I'm going to do is create a fake hard drive on there that just looks like NTFS, and that's all I really want to do. New devices, create partition table. Yes, apply. New NTFS. Add. Apply. And what this is going to do during the install, it's going to appear like we are doing a dual boot on a pre-existing system, which is one of the things I definitely want to give you guys the example of, just so you know what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to do a reboot. I'm going to interrupt the boot process by hitting F12. I'm going to mount my Ubuntu 10.10 ISO image, hit continue. The boot process for a live CD in the VM does take a couple extra seconds. It's not horrible, but it does take a little bit longer. When you actually boot to a real operating system in a VM, I find most of the time the boot process is faster, and that's because the hardware that it's emulating is more standardized. It's simpler hardware, more efficient hardware. It isn't these obscure video cards or obscure chipsets on the motherboard. Okay, even when I do an install, there are two choices you can pick on this first screen, and they are to test or try Ubuntu or install Ubuntu. I always go to try Ubuntu. I like two options it gives me. One is I can load gpart it up, examine the hard drive, make sure it looks like how I expect it to look. And secondly, this is a real live full-blown desktop that allows me to do everything I'm used to doing in a real install. That's one of the golden things about Linux, and that's what freedom can give you. Now you can see I have an 8 GB drive. All 8 gigs are taken by this NTFS partition. That's exactly what I wanted. Let's go ahead and start the install process. Okay. While this is going on, we technically could be on a different desktop down here, and we could be browsing the internet, checking our email, doing whatever you want to do. It does a couple pre-install checks, and it has a couple checkboxes. The first one is to download updates while installing. The example I give to this is when you install Windows, everybody knows the first thing you have to do is you have to go to Windows Update, download updates, reboot, download updates, reboot, download updates, reboot. Who knows how many times? Because this operating system does not think you're a thief, and it's freely distributable on its own. They encourage you to slipstream essentially all of your updates into your install. For the essence of time, I'm going to leave this unchecked. I also encourage you, if you're doing this on a real computer, make sure you have a wired connection and not a wireless connection. Your likelihood of having driver issues, I'm saying in quotes drivers, I'll learn about that later, are almost none when it's a hard wired connection. When it's wireless, I've still seen over 80% success rate on this live CD. The second one is to install third-party software. That gives you the ability to play MP3s from your first boot, which a lot of Windows users are accustomed to. We get 3 choices when there is existing data on the hard drive. First one is install alongside other operating system. That means dual boot, which is what we're going to do here. The second one is to erase and use the entire disk. Blank everything that's on that hard drive, start from scratch. This is going to be the only bootable operating system. Or 3, specify partitions manually. There's only a couple reasons you want to do this, especially as a beginner user. The one reason I would give very early on is you want to learn how to keep your home partition on its own partition, or your home folder on a separate partition. And that's just because of the way settings and configurations are saved. It just makes it very easy to do. Okay, we're going to install alongside another operating system. Go ahead and hit forward. You can see here we have a visualization. We have a little slider here in the middle. On the left is Windows, on the right is Ubuntu. You can slide this up and down, left and right, however you want to do it. Or you can change your mind and do the entire disk. Go ahead and hit install now. We're going to continue. It just gives us a warning. You're going to overwrite. You're going to modify the partitions. Just wants to be sure. Now, if you have any issues with resizing these partitions automatically, usually it means Windows has to be defragged. I know a lot of people say with the newest Vista and Windows 7 you don't need to defrag. Well, you actually do. NTFS does a very poor job of automatically defragging your files. There's nothing on our drive, so it worked very well. And if you notice down here, it's actually started to install already. We have a couple more things to do, but it's still working. These last settings are more user settings versus full-blown operating system settings. We're going to pick our time zone. Go ahead and hit forward. Next setting should be for our keyboard layout. Yep. Go ahead and hit forward. This is a multinational install also. Unlike Windows, sometimes you need the French version or the German version. Not with most Linux, you just download the one version. Next one is where you pick your username, password, and your computer name. For these purposes, we're just going to call it D2D. Computer name, D2D, VM. Pick a username, leave D2D. Now for your password. Never ever use the word password. Passwords are more critical in Linux because this is a true multi-user system. Security is very advanced in these systems, not like Windows where it's very vanilla how it spreads everything out. This is telling me I have a weak password because I am, for testing purposes, using the word password. Highly encourage you to use at least a 12-character password with at least something in it. An exclamation point, a pound sign, a number or two, something. Next setting, login automatically. I actually discourage against this because this is a secure system and it really shouldn't be logging in automatically. Now, if you have a Myth TV box or some kind of home theater system or a server to some degree, home server doing certain tasks, go ahead and check it. But for desktop use, require my password to log in. Encrypt my home folder. I always leave blank because if I do have to recover data from that disk, boot to a CD and try to copy files off, it is definitely more difficult to do when it is encrypted. Now the installation has started. We're welcome with screens. You can click on these buttons, go through different options and high points about the operating system. You can read about it if you want. Or down here you can go to a different desktop environment where you don't have to see the install going on. You can come up here to the applications. You can launch a game if you want while you're doing this. Go browse the internet if you want while you're doing this. One of the things I like to do, the other reason I like coming into this live system, I can go System, Preferences, Remote Desktop. This gives me the availability to start this install process up, then go to my phone or to another computer upstairs and remotely connect to this computer, look just like it's a real computer, and continue the install remotely. I don't have to be sitting in front of here the whole time just to see what's going on. Again, that's one of the perks with having a truly open and free environment where they don't assume you're a pirate. I'm doing this in a VM, so we're getting a little buggy activity. Okay, we're gonna let this installation continue on, and with the magic of editing, we will be back. Okay, the installation is done. You can continue testing, stay in the live environment, do whatever you want to do, or you can restart now. And a little note, if you see the power indicator, which is where you can go to change your state, when you're in a real system, there will be log off, restart, shut down, those kind of options. It's red. It's red means the system is expecting a restart. Okay, we're going to go ahead and restart now, and we are going to boot right into that newly installed, fresh install of Ubuntu. Up to here, real versus VM, it's virtually identical, especially if you do a hardwire connection. If you do the wireless, of course, you have to pick what network you're connecting to, input the type. Well, type usually gets picked up correctly. WEP, WPA, WPA2, and then you just enter your password. Live boot CD, it wants us to eject the CD first. How you eject devices, you come here to CDs, remove disk, then hit enter, and it will continue to reboot. Like I said, most of the time the boot is actually faster in a VM. I have seen it where I give half the RAM as much as it would in the native OS, and yet I still see like a 20-30% increase in boot speeds. One of the pluses to it. Here comes the login screen. I'm just going to go ahead and click on my username, type in my password, and hit enter. And we're going to go to the desktop. Okay, if this was a real hardware install, odds are the first thing you would see pop up is a icon up in the notification bar up here by the network settings, the sound settings, the Me menu settings. We'll get into that later. That looks like a PCI card or a card that goes on your motherboard. That means there's additional drivers found that will help in the performance of your system. Usually they're video drivers or wireless drivers, something to that effect. Since this is a VM, we're not getting that. One thing I want to show you is if I resize this window, you notice it does not resize properly, and that's because this does not have the correct video drivers. I call them drivers. They're not really drivers. In Linux, they're called modules, and that's because this is a modular based operating system. We're going to install the virtual guest additions. So you go to your devices menu, click that. You'll see a CD appear on your desktop, and in your places menu, the desktop takes a couple seconds in the VM. Let's go ahead and click it just so it properly mounts it or loads it. And we see a bunch of files. The one we need to run is called vbox linux additions.run. Now, by default out of the box, there is no super simple way to run as root or administrator this file from the GUI. So for this, we're going to go to the command line. Later, I'll show you how we can add custom commands to this right-click menu so we can do it in the GUI. The one thing you have to know is the path to the CD. If you hit Control L up here, this will change into the full path to that CD. So now let's pull up a command or a terminal window, and we're going to go to that drive. Now, quick tip, tab completion. I hit M, E, tab, media, capital V, add-ons. We're going to do LS to list the files just to verify, VBox, Linux additions. Now I'm going to give a little example of why I like Linux for users. Now you have to hit period / before it. That means execute this following command. I said we had to do it as root or super user or administrator, but I'm not. I'm just saying execute, and I get this error. This program must be run with administrator privileges aborting. To run it as administrator in Ubuntu, you type sudo, super user do. Now, because the command line is so powerful in Linux, here's another plus you get to it. I don't want to retype that whole thing over again, / VBox Linux addition. So I just type ! after the sudo space, and it says run the previous command with sudo in front of it. Go ahead and type in the password, hit enter. Now it's installing these drivers. And if you read the screen, it will actually say building modules. It only takes a minute or two, but again, you can do anything you want while this is happening. You can open up Firefox if you want, and you can go to your favorite website, catch up on your forums, see if there's anything new in your RSS feed reader while this is doing it, and everything will work just fine. It will be a touch slower in a VM because it is doing other things at the same time, but that's to be expected. This is just about rounding third. Now there's only two times, well, one time you need to reboot the computer in Linux, and that is when the kernel gets rebuilt or you have a new kernel version, which is like the heart, the brains of the computer. The second thing is when there's a new video driver, you at least need to restart the display. 99.99% of the time, that's fine by just logging out and logging back in. But reboot does the same thing. Up here on this restart menu, the options are typically lock screen, guest session, switch user or switch from D to D, log out, suspend, hibernate, restart, shutdown. You can see down here it's all done. We're going to Control D to exit out of that, X out of this. We are going to unmount that virtual CD of the guest add-ins, and we're going to do a restart. And again, the boot process you're going to see is only going to take a second or two. The first boot into the new install does take a couple more seconds. There's a couple settings that have to be tweaked, and it does it on its own. There's nothing you have to do. Okay, coming back up, getting to the login screen. Go ahead and click D2D, log in. Okay, now first thing I want to show you is that these drivers, video drivers, actually intelligently resize the resolution in the VM when you just click and drag. It's one of the golden things I like about Linux and how everything works. And in virtual operating systems, it really does work tremendously well. That's the end of this video. We're going to move on to the next one. Okay, just one more super quickie. Because the NTFS partition that we resized did not have a genuine Windows NTLDR bootloader on the front of it. Ubuntu realized that, and it knows that's not a true bootable partition with Windows on it. So when we boot up our VM, we're not getting the boot option screen of, do you want to boot to Windows or you want to boot to Ubuntu? I've only heard of very, very, very few instances where it did not recognize that correctly. If we did have a genuine Windows install in that VM, we would have seen the screen properly. Just wanted to make sure that was clear. Thank you.